to get us going. Now, here, and I'll share my screen. Cool. Here we are. See everything okay? You can hear me okay?
Yep.
We're off to a good start. Yeah, this is actually a look at a Kirchenstück within the Pfalz area. Kirchenstück is part of the village of Forst, but it's known to be one of the warmest growing sites within the Pfalz area. And because of that, probably one of the more recognizable or most famous, but where we start off standing in the vineyards within Pfalz, the Forst village, and then Kirchenstück, again, this particular famous vineyard site, where you can find some of the top examples of wines from some of the leading producers. They all have parcels within this property down below. And how we're doing this, because we did have a few first classes, so I was going to try to get around to, where we spent time on like as many wine classes, like the history, geography, the climate. There's a lot related to wine laws. If it's the German wine law that kind of was established in 1971, where they rewarded this predicat system. It's like a level of a point of harvest that is oftentimes associated with a level of sweetness. And even the group of growers called the Verbandischer Portugeiser Weingüter, Verbandischer, yeah, Portugeiser Weingüter, the VDP, where they've kind of originally started off as a focus on dry styles, unchapelized. They're not adding anything to it, more of like what the grapes would go and how they best express from the vineyard. But since this wine law kind of rewarding wines or basing them off a quality level based with like Cabernet, Spätlese, Alsace, Baron Alsace, a level of harvest, this VDP made a switch to almost like a Burgundian model, where they're still trying to recognize not only just regions, but villages, and within villages like Premier Crus and Grand Crus. But we covered a lot of it, and it's a lot of information there in front of us, but I did keep it in front of us in case it helps with a quick review. And please stop me at any time, because this is your class here today, and we can get into the thick of it if we want. But maybe summarizing these things a little bit more, being the last class, I really like to just dive in from here, going into these Pfalz, Baden, Wüttermburg, Franken. I won't actually spend too much time on the Heischesbergstrasse or the Middle Rhine, but we are definitely going to get up to Salzkammergut, Sachsen, and then finishing in the R. And then with the background and history, just where I, give us some context always. I mean, it was the Romans. They were the ones to bring viticulture this far north. And it goes back as 300 AD, where they first originally planted was in Trier in the southern Mosel. But as the Romans kind of fall to the backdrop, we do have the Middle Ages and a lot, kind of like a same like Burgundian almost history, where it was these monasteries, Benedictine Cistercian monks, that were also planting these vineyards, documenting vineyard sites. And they got to have some of the largest holdings in all of Europe during the Middle Ages. Think of like Kloster Eberbach of the Rheingau. They used to have some of the largest holdings up in that area. 1402, this is where we see the first documentation of Riesling when it appears. Some of the oldest wines in the world are said to be based off Riesling varietal. I think there's even a place, and I mean, there's houses and like Rheingau, like Schloss Schönborn, that supposedly have Rieslings going back to the 1700s, but certainly an age-worthy variety. And then once we get into these later harvest examples that Riesling can do so well with, Spätlese, first discovered, and that was up in where? Maybe I'll include Venkat every once in a while, do a little back and forth Q&A. It was in Johannesburg of the Rheingau area, but then later discovering like Auslese, and then even later examples of Baron Auslese. But late 1700s, when Napoleon defeats Germany and annexes all land west of the Rhine River, this is where we see these vineyards taken from the church within this revolution and then given into private ownership. And just like, again, this similarity in like a Burgundian history kind of, these vineyards were, there was the Napoleonic Code where your holdings were equally divided amongst inheritances. And then over a couple 100-year period of time, you'd have all this like mass division of ownership where it got to be kind of confusing. And they've made some efforts from there to consolidate things and then hopefully a way of simplifying labeling and whatnot. But church-owned vineyards are secularized, and we have the formation of the Napoleonic Code. And then 1800s are golden era for German Rieslings. I don't think we saw a lot of that throughout the mid-20th century when there's things like Blue Nun. But we remind ourselves in the late 1800s, the most prized wine, we always reference the wine list on the Titanic. It was a wine from the Rheinhessen that had a higher price point outside of even like the best of Bordeaux, the best of like fortified wines like ports that were so popular at the time. But it was moving to the 1900s. This is the original Bourbon Duscher and Nitro Weinsteiger, when perhaps people were moving into slightly more conventional winemaking. These folks were just trying to, again, make wines based off more natural methods, meaning they're not adding sugar to it prior to fermentation to build richness and fullness in the wines. They just wanted to represent the vineyard's best self. But as we take that move into the 20th century and conventional winemaking, there was a lot of rise of these crossings. They're moving into flatter lands. People were abandoning vineyards and working in local factories. And because it is rather cold, we're bordering the 50th parallel, or it's almost too cold to grow grapes. These more like cold hardy varieties, these crossings, because they're always ensured a safe harvest, like things like Müller-Thurgau, why they got to be so widely grown. That was one of the main grapes into our Blue Nun styles that I think it took a little while for German winemakers to present themselves differently internationally. And then this is the 1971 German wine law that made an effort to consolidate all these mass holdings from 30,000 to 2,600. But what happened a little bit with this process is that you had all these particular vineyard sites that somehow got lost because they're grouped with larger, I guess, vineyard areas. So what certain producers found as sites that were so unique, they're kind of identifying those again so they can represent place through their wines and their labels. These vineyards that were lost prior to this 1971 consolidation. So they look at old like tax records and Napoleonic maps and stuff like that, where they can find these historic sites. And that's what they're really trying to highlight in the next step of the VDP, which is just this extension of what started in the early 1900s. Of just recognizing region, village, and then Premier Cru and Grand Cru. And then this is, I think we're familiar, but please don't let me assume anything by any means. Qualitats wine, just a level of quality. It has to come from these 13 major regions that are make up our map. And then in this lower one, you can have Trocken dry, half Trocken off dry. And then when we're in that top tier, Cabernet Spätlese, Auslese, Baron Auslese ice wine, which is again related to a point in harvest, how much sugars that the grape have at the time when you pick, and then not always sweet, but sometimes there's that association of riper fruit, usually higher sugar levels, but you can certainly ferment dry. And then this is a little look at our VDP, which is just a growers consortium or organization that's not supported by the official German wine law, but so many people are involved with. And then them just recognizing Gross log, which is essentially your Grand Cru, Erslog, which is Premier Cru. I know that's kind of in reverse here on the slides, but then Orts wine, village wine, and then Guts wine, regional wine. And the other thing, because we're working at a Gross log Grand Cru site, what they would just call it if they were making a dry style is this Grossgewachs. Being an unofficial labeling term because it's not legally recognized. They just call it GG. But if you ever see GG, you know it's a dry wine, and then you know that it's coming from a top gross log or Grand Cru site. Otherwise, it might just be this lower classification Qualitats wine, and they might just call it Trocken dry or have Trocken off dry. We're doing okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
I ran by that but we can, I think when we visit these areas, if questions come up related to what we just kind of breeze through, I think we can apply it to where we go next. So we're hanging out in the Pfalz. Maybe it's not so bad. The other thing to summarize really fast, when we're looking at this, you know, like Mosel, this is where the Romans really kind of first planted down here in southern Trier. But if you want light, pretty, delicate examples, oftentimes with a touch of sweetness, or where you usually see that more often, if you had to generalize, the Mosel, lightest, prettiest, oftentimes off dry. Rheingau, it's actually just unique because it's all one south-facing vineyard site. And even though there are sweet examples in their history of like Spätlese and Alsace from Johannesburg, there's also a strong history on dry examples. And again, with generalizations, when we're trying to break down these areas, Rheingau, a little bit drier, a little more powerful than the sweet, elegant, light examples from the Mosel. Rheinhessen, this is where a lot of our Müller-Thurgau is sourced from, where we're looking at our Blue Nuns or Liebfraumlich wines that came about. It's not quite the power of Rheingau, but not quite the lightness of Mosel. It's kind of hard to pinpoint a certain style, but we have top producers like Dunhoff, Schaefer, Froelich, and then we're heading down to Pfalz. And I think it's good to point those things out because once we get into Pfalz, we are moving into the southern areas, and that's in not only southern, but moving inland into more continental areas, especially once we get over up into this neck of the woods. So Pfalz, out of all these areas, if you had to have like really one strong takeaway, you're definitely thinking of the potential of dry Rieslings, and with a little more warmth and richness to these sites, a slightly more powerful style. And that's why it works out well. You have ripe enough fruit that you can ferment it to dryness, and you're not trying to balance out that really sharp acidity with some sort of reserve sugar, like that idea of making lemonade that you'd probably try to do more often if you're in the Mosel. So it's just a chance to really get into dry examples of Riesling. And we see this a lot going into Baden and elsewhere too, but it's the slow beginning of almost like a shared growing conditions that you'd find just west of here, going into like areas similar to like Burgundy. And you start to see Spätburgunder, Pinot Noir, Weissburgunder, Grauburgunder, and more so as we move west. But this is about 25,000 hectares. It's quite a lot. It's a big part of German production here. You have about 102,000 hectares overall. And then second largest just to Rheinhessen. So second largest Weinbaugebiet, which is just your wine growing region. And then Rheinhessen is just directly north of us, where we're coming from. And then from here, it's the country's largest acreage of Riesling. I think they actually produce more up in Rheinhessen, but here perhaps acreage wise, they have slightly more planted. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it on a world scale. There's even more here than like Austria, Australia, and the United States found within the Pfalz. And then being warm and sunny, you know, why we get this full-bodied dry Riesling. And we're getting diversity here now. We're branching away from just our Riesling as the name of the game, where if it's not these Burgundian grapes, Spätburgunder, Grauburgunder, Weissburgunder, we see other varietals like Dornfelder, Portugeiser, and Schrub. I would say Schrub is a pretty popular one, especially when we're up here in areas like Karlstadt and Ungstein, where there's a stronger focus on it. And then what the VDP does, this little group of growers, and it's a group and quite a bit of overall growers belong to this organization. For a gross log release, they protect certain varietals that they associate with German history and quality. So for gross log bottling within the VDP organization, it's limited to not only Riesling, but I guess, again, how you can maybe summarize it is the use of Spätburgunder, Grau, and Weissburgunder grapes. But you can do that at some of the top levels. So you have this prized site, it's been in your family history for a long time, or you're a newer grower and you're thinking about what to plant, and it's considered a Grand Cru property, and your VDP, you know that you'd probably be playing around with some of these 4 major grapes, because that's what's recognized for how they just behave in the vineyard sites. But it's a broader region, being larger in size, slightly less renowned vineyards than what you'd find in like Mosel and then the Rheingau that do have this strong history. But just like Alsace, because Alsace is just south of us. If we open up the map a little bit larger, we're Alsace being back and forth between German and French property. It's kind of been this back and forth history for like the last couple hundred years. And even some of these producers down in the far southern parts, they have holdings right across the border into Alsace. And like this one producer, Frederick Becker, we've had a Pinot Noir on our list from him. And it's kind of wild, like 70% of the fruit is actually sourced within Alsace, but then he makes the wine in Germany. So it's kind of funny, like you're kind of having a taste of both French and German Pinot Noir. And then what we have here on the map on the left, or the western side, is the Hart Hills, which is just an extension of the Vosges Mountains, which starts further below, and it kind of mellows out as it moves further north. So you're less protected by the mountains the further north that you get. The Vosges Mountains is what strongly shapes the region of Alsace. And it kind of creates, so even though we're further north compared to Alsace, because you'd always think like, oh, we're cooler up here being further north. Because of this mountain range on the western side, it forms a rain shadow effect. So any moisture in the air as it rises in elevation and cools and condenses at altitude, you're going to get all your rainfall usually on the western side of the mountain. So just like in Alsace, although again, said it being further north, it's actually one of the driest and sunniest areas in all of France. So yeah, they make wonderful white wines there. That's their focus, but you can get really ripe, lush examples from it. And that's just from this little pocketed area that happens to be so sunny and dry. And that's exactly kind of what you get up here in the Pfalz, this rain shadow effect from these Vosges Mountains. We could just call it the Hart Hills further north. And what's slightly different here too is that a lot of the Mosel, it's based off of this blue slate. Sometimes you see red slate that gives it more texture, usually the wines and the way that they drink. As a larger region, you kind of have this patchwork of different soil types. I mean, it goes back like close to like 250 million years ago when it was just rivers bringing alluvial soils. Then there's like volcanic eruptions like close to 50 million years ago, this collision of tectonic plates. So you just get a wide diversity of everything from sandstone to limestone to volcanic. And I guess just like when you go to Alsace, because it's all about neighboring regions, what can be so special about it is that one part of the vineyard, you might have granitic, like volcanic rock. And the next part of the vineyard, just maybe even 20 feet away, not that far at all, you might have more limestone. And then certain producers, they'll pick their fruit that way, ferment them separately and bottle them that way. So you can try varietals from these specific sites that they identify bringing different qualities in the way that they drink. And you can kind of find that a little bit here too. So this diversity of soils in this slightly broader region. Usually limestone, sharper, leaner styles, sandstone, it's going to be kind of softer, rounder, and it usually seems like it's lower lying closer to the valley floors. And most important vineyards lay further north. I think you can kind of see that, if we just look at this here, where all is everything clustered, where are all of our major villages with our orange and yellow blobs all right here, and then hugging again the hillside, slowly starting to climb up into elevation. And then they have essentially like major wine growing regions, barrique they call them, and this one is divided into two, and it's really just the Mittelhart Weinstrasse, and that's this lighter gray area to the north. And then to the south, Südlich, which just means south, Weinstrasse. And both named after the swine route that was built in 1935, that they thought it would allow for a way of tourism to provide a way of transportation to encourage awareness of these areas, and I guess tourism and popularity for these wines that might have gotten lost from the last couple hundred years prior or something. And the other thing here, just because it's great that we can see the hills along the west, a lot of these shapes, because we're in a cooler region, Mosel, you're right along the Mosel River, and your vineyards usually have to be south facing. And then it's that tempering influence from the river and the slate soils that absorb and reflect heat that allow you to grow these grapes in such a rather otherwise perhaps difficult situation. Rheingau is again all south facing right along the Rhine. And this is the Rhine River, but you can see that the vineyards, they're a little bit further away. So not quite as directly influenced as a tempering geological feature. So now how we're going to do this is we're really just breaking it into the two major breaks, the Mittelhart-Dusch Weinstrasse to the north, just 20 kilometers south of Worms, which is the southern part of Rheinhessen down below. So it seems like it'd be a pretty quick drive. And it is in this northern part, again, where you have the most historic and the most famous villages. And then similar to the Côte d'Or, our Burgundian region. And this wild, you guys familiar with Burgundy? Not that you have to be so much.
Yeah.
Kind of like, yeah, it's just like, if you go there, it's kind of wild. Like you can just, all these famous Grand Crus that cost hundreds of dollars from these famous villages, you can almost just, you just really almost take a bike ride and you're just going from one major vineyard site to the next. They're all right in a row. And you can see that here. It's not like you have a vineyard here and then you drive along rolling hills and you come across another one over here. They're just all closely connected right by each other on essentially like a eastern, southeastern facing slopes. Why there's that comparison. They're just all kind of connected, all kind of clustered together. And the north, similar to what you find in Côte d'Or. It's crazy. Like they seem so susceptible. You have these famous vineyard sites and they're not protecting anything. You can just like walk through them like no problem. But anyway, best vineyards usually mid slope. That's always kind of true too. Burgundy is like that 250, 275 range if you're higher up. Lighter expression, shallower soils if you're lower down slope. It's usually water, heavier soils producing softer examples. But besides being mid slope, it's this forest line at this top of the hill, the Palatinate forest tree line that also has a protecting influence against these vineyards, and perhaps why these grapes can grow so well there. And then many of these modern Grosslag, which is just our Grand Crus, they do have a history, and this is kind of about how they got lost in that consolidation, the Flurbereinigen of like 30,000 to 2,600 vineyards. They're identifying from this old Bavarian land registry, like, oh, why I'm farming these grapes, and then it's kind of fun. Maybe you just are already aware because your family history, but like, oh my gosh, no, this used to be one of the most highly prized sites like 2,000 years ago. And it might be something completely foreign to us today, but now we see that it's potential almost because of its background. And then that referencing that monastery influence, ecclesiastical origins from the 12th and the 13th century. Thank you, Cistercian monks. And then most Grosslag, Grand Cru, Premier Cru, it's really kind of just tucked in between this forest and this Diedesheim. So again, really kind of collected all in one major area. And then fractured ownership since Napoleon. This Flurbereinigen, that's that consolidation. If you ever come across that or hear someone talking about that, I can't imagine that's the case unless you're reading wine books. And it makes sense though, like who's going to learn all these vineyard sites? It becomes kind of meaningless. So what's kind of frowned upon now, you can see why they made that effort and try to simplify things and make things more approachable. But things always have their twists and turns. And then part of this though, this is why it's actually kind of cool. This consolidation of sites, not to beat a dead horse here, but it required that the minimum size be 5 hectares. So if you had a site that was smaller than that, then it's just going to be grouped together with perhaps a more well-known area or vineyard. But there are sites that have been so famous. The one that comes to mind outside of the Pfalz region right away is the Doctor Vineyard in the Mosel, where it is the Riesling from the site that cured this bishop of all of its illnesses, but that they're actually able to retain their name, even though if it was smaller in size than what was required at the time. And you see quite a few of those retained here in the Pfalz, and those examples would be this Hohenmorgen, I think it's actually Hohenmorgen in Diedesheim, and then Frunstück in Forst, and then there's this Kirchenstück, the vineyard we're looking at on our first slide. Even though it's 3.7 hectares, roughly the size of a soccer field or 100 meters by 100 meters, it has that history and background that you're still able to bottle it that way as a single vineyard, recognized at a higher quality. And then Geimenden and Einzellagen, these are just our famous or important villages, and then the vineyards within that. Like, and we just go north to south, like Karlstadt, the northernmost, there's a famous vineyard inside that called Samagen, and it actually means pig stomach. I suppose it's great with certain cured meats and things along those lines. And then there's a producer up there, it's not Kloster Eberbach, Kohler Ruprecht is the name of the guy that's up there. And why it does so well, it's because it's like this amphitheater that traps a lot of the sun's heat while you're able to assure a level of ripeness. And if we're talking about any other areas outside these major two, where a lot of these top sites are located, Samagen is the major one north of Forst that we should be aware of. And then you move into like Ungstein, and there are wonderful producers like from Bad Dürkheim and even Wachenheim. But once we move into Forst, that's where we get this high population of celebrated vineyards. Kirchenstück. If you haven't heard it, if you're going to remember anything, once you see a wine that's labeled Forst or Kirchenstück, or maybe it's just Kirchenstück by itself because it's so famous. I learned something today. It's the warmest site in all of Pfalz. But, you know, and how can that translate to style? I mean, you're just going to get a riper, fuller, richer example of Riesling if you happen to be trying a Riesling from somewhere, a village elsewhere within the Pfalz. That's, where does it lend and what can you expect and how the wines will drink. And there's only 8 owners. So there's only 8 producers that you'd be able to try that are actually making wine from this site. And then it's actually shaped enclosed by the small sandstone wall. And it's interesting too, when we talk about the potential of other varietals, this is completely planted to Riesling. So you're only going to see Riesling from the Kirchenstück site. Other top vineyards within the Forst area like Frunstück, Pakstein, Hauer, Justengarten, and then below that Diedesheim, the Lagenmorgen, Hohenmorgen, Kieselberg, and then down right underneath that, not too far, Forst, Diedesheim, Rupertsberg. Yeah, there's this Ritterfad vineyard, but it's this Geisbowl. It's a monopole, so it's completely owned by one producer, and that's Birkeland Wolf. So perhaps you're a fan of Birkeland Wolf, you're interested in trying these site-specific wines, you know that maybe one of the top ones that he could produce is this Geisbowl, because it's only him and it's only his property. It's back down below. There it is. There we find Eidig. So, and then within the Mittelhart Dusch Weinstrasse of the Northern Pfalz, where most of our important sites are found, when you're trying to learn producers, they always talk about the 3 Bs, Reichsstraat von Bühl, Birkeland Wolf, and then Bassermann Jordan. And then all 3 of these guys, Bassermann Jordan, Birkeland Wolf, and von Bühl, they are 3 of the 8 owners of Kirchenstück. So you could see each of these producers and how their wines drank from the same site. So you could just get these different expressions specifically from the different producers, which is kind of fun. Kohler Ruprecht. He's the one, and this is another way of looking at our villages, our Geimenden. Like you can see then scrolling up, and then within Karlstadt in the north, this is our Salmagun, this is our pig stomach. Kohler Ruprecht, the producer based out of there. And then Müller-Thurgau, near village of Hart, which is actually further south. We can actually see it on this map here, where this gentleman's located. Müller-Thurgau, Shrub, it's such a, it can drink like a Sauvignon Blanc sometimes, but it just definitely has like this ripe citrus if it's orange, or if it's kind of peachy. It's just certainly a little more expressive. And they do make off-dry examples. Like we have a Kohler Ruprecht Shrub cabinet, so you know that it's a little off-dry, but still in the lighter examples versus like sweeter Auslese or Spätlese or Auslese or Baron Auslese. And you can see that Schruber Rieslinger I've never tried, but known for slightly lusher styles. And then Von Winning. So a modern producer, perhaps when you have, yeah, there we go. No, and then this is, I don't find this at all in the wines. We've had one of his more kind of entry-level releases on our list for quite a long time. So it's just good if you just want something dry and crisp and easy drinking with a little bit of that extra body and richness from this area. But maybe how he can be described is maybe on his earlier starts, if he was using a little more new Barrique, bringing textures to Rieslings that was perhaps an offshoot from other common winemaking styles. And I just think maps are so important because it builds context. Like I could say Kaltstadt, Boomstein, Bad Dürkheim, and all these things. But unless you start to see where things are coming from, it's hard to tie it to place. I get a little bit. So just another map, you know, where we can see the hard hills along the west. Kind of like, yeah. I mean, this is all forest. And then you can see like these major vineyards like Peckstein, Jesuitengarten, Kirchenstück, Frunstück. You can see our top premier cruise. So it's just kind of another way of looking at it. Hart down here, down below. Then we eventually get into our Southern Barrique, where we're going to get next. And then I thought this is another cool one where you can really get into the nitty gritty. And then maybe you have a producer not only trying maybe 3 different examples from top producers from one site. Maybe you could try one producer that you've really grown to like, and then you can start, oh, maybe, I mean, who knows if there's going to be strong differences, but where we start is with extremes. And it's Kirchenstück, the warmest right here. Well, how would that compare to their Jesuitengarten or their Peckstein or their Ugenhauer or their top site? And that's what allows for exploration. And I think we're collecting these wines and trying different bottlings can be fun. So we went through the north, or wine route up above, and we visited all these famous villages and vineyards. Now we're going to get into the southern part, Südliche Weinstraße. This, in comparison, is even slightly warmer, being further south. And until recently, with some of these younger startups, like these guys, Rebel, it's cool stuff. One of these leaders in biodynamic farming, even beginning in like the 90s. Cool Pinot Blancs or Weissburgunders to try. I haven't really actually tried much of this Dr. Werheim, and I didn't even actually see it available to us, but I'll include these producer names if I see them referenced in certain like, so, you know, like material. But for this Frederick Becker, this is the one that gentleman has vineyards in Alsace, and they're really known for their Pinot Noir. I've seen people using their wines, their Chardonnays in certain tastings and everything as well. So I feel like Burgundy, I don't know, if you I shouldn't say that all the time. The generalization, Germany Pinot Noir versus France or other areas, it's still going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit prettier examples than even neighboring France. And then from there, you just go into like, no, this is a really warm site, and you can get into like 14 plus alcohol, and it is a top site. So they're going to use new oak that brings creaminess and richness to it. But otherwise, if I'm looking at 2 things on a list, I'm always going to kind of expect that German Pinot Noir to drink a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter. And it's the it's besides France and the United States, Germany produces more Pinot Noir than any other country. It's third in production, which is kind of fun. And you see more and more being planted, like what they couldn't grow 20, 30 years ago. Now people are, when they're replanting the vineyards, they're considering this as a potential, a possibility for them, because temperatures warming, and they're finding a lot of success with it.
So I think in the UK, they were saying that too. The UK is going to become a great wine region in Europe because it's getting warmer and warmer. They weren't known at all for wine, and now they're starting quite well.
Yeah. I only get to try their sparkling wines up there every once in a while, but they talk about similar soils, chalky soils, whereas underneath this huge Paris basin, where it's cooler up there than even Champagne. It's Ridgeview or a couple other producers there. Seems like kind of still in the early parts of their beginnings, but there's like, holy cow, here, what's going to happen. Yeah, and I guess vineyards fell to disrepair and abandoned outright. I mean, that's kind of true. Gosh, in northern Mosel, you got these crazy steep vineyards, and for you to kind of hang around and try to make wines from these sites, like post-World Wars and phylloxera, all these things, these viticultural diseases, it wasn't, you couldn't really do it. You couldn't make a living from it. So that's when people just left these sites and went to the nearby towns where they would work in a factory. And then now it's only people kind of returning with the rise of popularity and the winemaking, where people now can go back and kind of tend these vineyards and focus on wine production. And so rediscovery of sites, kind of looking back at our pre-1971 wine consolidations, less tied to tradition. And that's kind of cool. If you're being a younger area with not quite celebrated sites, there's more opportunity for experimentation a little bit. So there's less tied to tradition that way. And then from the Südliche Weinstrasse, our southern Brieg, we just have these three major villages: Siebeldingen, Burgwiller, and then Schweigen. And then within these, some of our more notable vineyards, Im Sonnenschein within Siebeldingen, this Kasteinenbusch, which would be within this Burgwiller. We're just moving north to south. You can kind of see them on our map. I guess this one rather large site, 86 hectares, so pretty big. If you look at a Grand Cru in Burgundy, like Romani Conti, I think is like 1.5 hectares, so much smaller. Here we're talking about still a rather large size for this vineyard. Im Sonnenschein and Kemmerberg, best sites for Weissburgunder and Spätburgunder. So within these two villages, you'll find these vineyards where they're really kind of looking forward with the potential of Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir. Where are most top vineyards located? In the Pfalz, in the northern Mittelhart Weinstrasse, or in the south, Südliche Weinstrasse? In the north, right? Okay. I'll back up from there. Review. But yeah, we're just hanging out over here. And then in the northern parts, we have our more celebrated sites. In the south, it seems like potential for younger growers, people like Rebels and Becker. If you want to try some Strub later, you can try it probably from Côte Rupert in the further north. Now we're heading east. Look how big Baden is compared to the rest of these areas. Huge. Yeah, huge, right? Even Wüttermburg right next to it. Oftentimes they'll even be lumped together when you're like reading through most major wine books. Because it being a large area, again, it just doesn't.
Same state too.
What's that?
They're the same state. The state is Baden-Württemberg, right? Although the Badeners do not like the Württembergers and vice versa, but that's a different story.
And you're from Baden too, is that right?
Well, so I really grew up, the Black Forest is in both areas, but I actually grew up in the Württemberg side. So like my town, like about 5 miles out, that's where the old line, so it's like the old Napoleon line, by the way. So there are markers, like geography markers on there and separating the two.
Oh, wow. Yeah, like the Black Forest is just right about here, right?
Yep. Runs all the way, pretty much all of Baden, and then all the way close to the French border.
Yeah, and then where we had the Rhine River on the eastern part of the Pfalz, it just continues down here. So we have the Black Forest on the east, and then the Rhine River is down here on the western part of Baden. And then once you get to Switzerland, which is our major lake down here below, the river cuts east and then forms like the top border of Switzerland. But so this is where it's like 1, 2, first largest in production, Rheinhessen, Pfalz number 2, and then we go into Baden. There's the third largest Weinbaugebiet, and here's just the size in hectares, 16,000. Where we left off was about 25,000, just to put things in size for numbers. And then along the French border, so yeah, this would be Alsace, just that almost directly west of where we're at right now, and then that's what bled into the Pfalz. And we saw that extension of like the Vosges mountains kind of turning into hard hills that kind of gave us that rain shadow effect, and a slightly dry, sunny, warm area for grape growing. But lies on the eastern half of the upper Rhine, again, Rhine on the west, and then parallel to Alsace and Pfalz, just making sure I'm going through everything. And then about 400 kilometers north to south, just in size, so rather large. In the northern parts, we have the Oldenwald Hills in the Heißes area. It doesn't even make its way onto this map. It's just right directly north, kind of between Franken and Rheinhessen, this Heißes. And then the Tauber River near Würzburg and Franken, just as far north as it goes. And then the southern parts where it hits to northern Switzerland, Lake Constance, which separates Germany and Switzerland. And then again, just more so than what we saw in the rest of Pfalz, because there's a strong focus on Riesling. We really get into our Burgundian varieties. So you'll see that 3 of the 4 most planted grapes, Spätburgunder is the most, where it's a third of all plantings, 5,500 hectares. So Pinot Noir really comes to the forefront, along with their Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. White grapes, although we see such a popularity with Pinot Noir, white grapes are still slightly more planted. Müller-Thurgau, maybe even just an extension of the history of the 20th century as a crossing that was just high yielding and easy to grow. It's number 2 amongst these 4, if it's not our Burgundian varietals. So quite a lot. Müller-Thurgau, just kind of simple and refreshing and rather easy drinking. There's some fun examples produced from exciting producers. There's this one, Enderle and Mole. I'll put it in. They do, they're based in Baden, and they got to be known for some of their Pinot Noir, but they do like skin contact, Weissburgunder, Grauburgunder. They do like some skin contact Müller-Thurgaus. They're really fun and exciting. Top variety in the north and south, second most planted grape in Baden. Swiss side, Lake Constance. Yeah, and then if you actually go over to Switzerland, there is this wine region of Thurgau, and that's where Hermann Müller was born. He was the guy that made the crossing in the late 1800s of Müller-Thurgau. And such a large area. Like we broke down the Pfalz into 2 Barrique, like kind of wine divisions or departments, I guess. Mittelhart, Deutschweinstrasse, Südliche Weinstrasse. Here we have 9. Are you ready for that? Oh my gosh, I hope you're drinking more of that wine. I'm not gonna, it doesn't get as like labeling villages and vineyards, but hopefully we have takeaways with that stuff. You know what I'm saying? It's not just listing names to list names. But if we divide these 9 Barrique from this larger Weinbaugebiet wine growing region, we kind of take the northern parts, which isn't even on this map, to the next of us. There's Tuberfranken, Badisbergstrasse, and Kraichgau. I have a map later on that kind of brings these other Barriques into visual reference, because I think the heart of production is really what we find in these middle 4 Barriques that are shown here on the map, where there's Ortenau, Breisgau, Kaiserstuhl, and then Tuneberg. well, actually, Tunenberg's not even on here. It was previously a part of Kaiserstuhl.
That's very small. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I haven't even seen it really on a map. It's kind of hard to find even maps of these certain things, which is kind of wild. But if we then look towards the southern Brieg, which is only two, there's Markgraferland, and then we also have Bodensee, which is just over here on the far east. And these two bookends here, outside of this, you see a little bit more white wine production, where Müller-Thurgau seems to be the leading grape, kind of the bookend markers. And then within the center Briegs are heart of production in this larger area. This is where we find more Pinot Noir. Seems like that's the fame and the fortune almost a little bit. But Markgraferland, southernmost, Gutedal. This is kind of fun. Main grape of Switzerland as Chasselas. When I spent Enderley and Mole wrong in chat, there's an E at the end of Enderley. Anyway, just in case you're looking it up. And Chasselas, you actually find some in Alsace too. But yeah, here they might just call it Gutedal. It's always like a Chablis. It's just crisp and light and easy drinking for the most part. Great to have with some like rich cheeses, or I always have that picture in my head of like going skiing on an afternoon and getting out of the cold. You just want something crisp and light and refreshing. That's Chasselas, but over 1,000 hectares. That's quite a bit out of 16,000 hectares in total. And then Bodensee, the German lake, the German name for Lake Constance, but that would be over here on the eastern parts. So we're gonna zoom in a moment, but I think that just like Kirchenstück was the warmest area in Pfalz based out of the forest region. Even warmer than that, when we're looking at the country as a whole, we have Kaiserstuhl, which is the warmest Brieg. And then within that, we have the warmest vineyard site called from the village of Winkler. Yeah, Winkler Ehrenberger is the Ehrenberger. Yeah, is the warmest growing site, and that's all located within this Kaiserstuhl Brieg.
Frequently the warmest temperature in Germany altogether.
Oh yeah.
So the records are always broken there. Yeah. It's the first region to hit 40 degrees Celsius a couple of years back. So it's quite warm. If you don't believe in global warming, then you know it.
I'm always thinking Fahrenheit too, but I'm like, yeah, it's usually like people when they're talking about they're in like the 20s or so, like 26, I think, when it's like it's around 70. I think so when you say 40,
21 to 71. Yep.
Yeah, is that so 40's got to be pretty high.
Yeah. It's in the 90s. Yeah, it's in the high 90s. So it's definitely quite warm.
Yeah, like Russian River Valley of Sonoma is one of the warmest growing areas for Pinot Noir. And this is where you get this really dark fruited Pinot Noir examples. And they can almost taste like Zinfandel. And those are at like the 14 plus range. Well, check this out. Even though we're in Germany, from this Kaiserstuhl Brieg, you're getting 15 plus alcohol on your Pinot Noir. That's pretty ripe and that's pretty big. So it's like, oh, we start out with generalizations, but then you start focusing on certain regions. You might be talking about something completely different. Dynamic soils of granite, volcanic, calcareous, and those. Like, so again, just larger region, more of a diversity of soils, and then leading to potential of diversity of styles. But backs up against the Black Forest, and then here it actually shows us on the eastern parts, and then the Rhine here, just along the western side. And what's kind of funny even too about Kaiserstuhl, and I associate it just from a proximity of the river, where it actually sits right along the river's edge, which lends, I'd assume, like a rain influence where you can get really ripe examples. And then what we talked about previously in Pfalz, how we have this rain shadow effect where it's essentially protected by wet weather from these foliage mountains. And then compact steep chain of hills west of Freiburg. I said Freiburg up here a minute ago. There we go. Just these chain of hills on the western side. And then again, this is all Kaiserstuhl right here. The hills crown an extinct volcano with layers of loess. Loess is just windswept soils that have built up over time that might shape some of the top soils, I suppose. Best sites where they found on steeper, more volcanic soils. So if you're talking about a mix of diversity, volcanic or loess, it's usually the steeper, higher elevation sites where it's more volcanic rock, where the better vineyards are located. And then these are examples of those. We talked about that, the Winklerberg within the Ering village. That's the Germany's hottest vineyard, setting records. And then this Acker Schlossberg. I mean, we don't come across too terribly many wines from Baden. Some of it, again, it's like these kind of younger producers that are doing things like skin contact wines or these Pinot Noirs made in Burgundian barrels and things like that. So even though like Acker Schlossberg is listed here, I wouldn't be surprised if I were to even search for this, that they would even be available. It's just us kind of scratching the surface of
they like to drink it themselves. I mean,
that's what it sounds like.
But it's really interesting because most of them won't even make it out of the regions. I mean, that's Kaiserstuhl was always like a very local one. So if you go live elsewhere in Germany, you're very unlikely to encounter them too, unless it's really exclusive wine and really a lot of money. But for the most part, you go in a supermarket nearby and you'll find about 35 to 40% of them.
Are they how are they priced?
So it's really interesting. So I'm a little dated with my knowledge because I haven't been back to that in like 20 years, but it was incredibly inexpensive to get the wine like locally somewhere. So you can go like in a discount. It's almost like you go to Whole Foods is even expensive. You go to Trader Joe's and you would find the wine and they're probably the majority of them are going to be less than $10. And then obviously the good ones, you have to go in a wine store and then it's going to very quickly go above 20, 30, 40 bucks. But
yeah, and it doesn't seem like a huge part of production either. It's like this quality oriented by any means, like just it's us.
Yeah. I mean, the best way is to see it is go like during harvest time, just because most like Earing, Arkar, like all of those, even Tuniberg, they will all have their own little wine festivals, and that's where you can try and go from producer to producer, and just they'll set it up in one of those towns, and you'll taste them. And you better have a dedicated driver.
My mom, when I was doing one of these classes the other day, it was the Molza one. Just like she had been there like a year or two prior, and then she had to show me like pictures of the wine glass that you wear around your neck and everything.
That's right. Yep.
Talking about these local festivals.
You buy the glass in the beginning, and then you'll just go from producer to producer, and it's a lot of fun.
Never been. I can't wait to have this is not to get sidetracked. I'm from a town called New Ulm, Minnesota, Midwest, and they're from Ulm in Germany. I know that's further east. Sounds like stuff to you, but I don't know. It'd be fun to go. I had a great grandfather that planted Riesling. Anyway.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, Tuniberg, the last, like when we're highlighting these major barriques, this one was previously a part of Kaiserstuhl until like 1991 or so. And then what might define this or set itself apart is that it's a little more calcareous, more loess versus what's considered to be slightly higher quality volcanic soils of Kaiserstuhl. And then just looking at Pinot Noir and its influence, arrived in Baden by this Carolingian emperor, Charles the Fat. So it's kind of fun to repeat that. Like, who was the guy that had such a strong influence, or why do we have Pinot Noir in Germany? Because of Charles the Fat. But that was over 1,000 years ago, in 884, when they thought it to be brought over and planted. And then another major area for Pinot Noir, if it's not Baden, is Ahr further north. And it's kind of weird because Ahr sits above the Mosel again, and it's like this little hot pocketed like area where they have a little extra sun and can guarantee ripeness. But here, much fuller examples than if you would find further north. And then just some of the common winemaking, like you'll see whole cluster being used every once in a while. Sometimes with Pinot Noir, the major winemaking is like you can destem the fruit, giving you softer styles, like fermenting without the stems, or you can crush the grapes and ferment with the stems, whole cluster. And there's another way of bringing texture and backbone. A lot of times, so sometimes you'll see producers feeling really strong about one way or the other, softer destem before like tannic structured whole cluster. Usually if you're working with less ripe fruit, you don't want to lend too much of the stems whole cluster because it might be too astringent then. But it's fun here where it's warm enough, ripe enough that producers are playing around with that to give it some sort of background to these wines. And then even though New Oak isn't super frequent, some of the better wines are being oak aged, as in like top Premier Crus or Grand Crus of Burgundy would be. And then that is kind of interesting. Yeah, Dijon clones. These are these, because the clones are a huge thing with Pinot Noir, and Dijon is just these ones that were isolated in Dijon, and why they're so heavily planted in Burgundy is because they're earlier ripening, and that helps them because it's cooler. But like even in California, if you're using Dijon clones, you're just ripening the fruit too fast. You need something that needs a little extra time. So why they're stepping away from Dijon earlier ripening clones here, and they're looking for other options. Some coming from Switzerland, this Mariafeld, or they have some other German clones that might be just
interesting.
Yeah, they're playing around with that. And then Weissburgunder, within Kaiserstuhl, you might find some Brique aged examples. So if you do like quality Chardonnay from Burgundy, maybe you might start coming across some people making wines in a similar style. Again, not something that's flooding our wine list or even easy to find. And then still only 10% of production. And then Grauburgunder. What's interesting is, so when we talked about the VDP and what authorized for Großlager Grand Cru sites, they protect the varietals that can be used. So I can't just do a Gewürztraminer from a Großlager site and call it Grand Cru GG dry or something like that. But where you can here is you can do that with Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio or Grauburgunder. So it's like the one place where you can actually see Pinot Grigio kind of with its best foot forward, planted on the very most highly respected vineyard sites. And then it seems like they're still focused on sweeter styles, and then it might just be under the local synonym as Ruhlander. Riesling, why is it full body? Because it's really warm. And then where are you finding most of your Riesling as smaller plantings? It'd be further north. If we're still within the center region of Briques, it'd be up in like Ortenau and then Kraichgau, which seems like it must just be relatively cooler regions. But this is still co-ops, the name of the game, and you see a lot with that in Wüttermburg. What's fun here is they have a style of rosé Weissherbst. It's considered to be higher level quality because they have a rosé in Wüttermburg called Schiller wine. Weissherbst, it's usually based off of a single varietal, and then you can release a Weissherbst under a Qualitats wine or even Predicat level. So maybe associated as higher level quality versus the Schiller wine of neighboring Wüttermburg, another area large in size, still overall majority produced by co-ops. This Schiller wine, unique to this area, you just blend like red and white wines together. You can do that in Champagne too, but not too many other places. But you're making rosés that way as opposed to single varietal, crush it in short maceration. So the rule is a blend, and then they're just light, easy drinking, and could be dry or off dry styles. German meaning German verb for schillen, to shimmer, just where the Schiller wine rosé gets its name. But it doesn't look like that here, but it does seem like there are parts of Wüttermburg that does extend all the way to the southern border. It seems like where the majority is located. And just like we went 1, 2, 3, we're now in the 4th largest region, down to 11,000 hectares, 25,000, 16,000, 11,000. That makes you go a little cross-eyed. But red wine focus more than any other Weinbaugebiet. And I think that's true, just where we're moving inland. It's even more continental, where red wine comes to the forefront. Only other place that has a higher percentage of plantings to reds is that R. And this is where I was talking about where Pinot Noir does so well. You'd find lighter examples here than what you'd find here, Baden. It's not the most planted grape of Wüttermburg. The most planted grape is Trollinger, which is also known as Schiava in Italy, like Alto Adige, known as Grenache, but just really light, pretty reds. We'd oftentimes compare it to Gamay when we first started being introduced to more and more examples, but it's kind of fun that this is the most planted grape at 2,300 hectares. And moving into with other major red grapes, this is where we start to see more Lemberger or Blaufränkisch, which we find in New York. And well, I mean, not only Austria, but New York, a little if you're in New York too. And then Schwarz Riesling, this is fun. Meunier, one of the third, perhaps one of the third major grapes of Champagne, but less familiar than Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. You can actually see it here as a still example. Meunier, really light. It can almost look like a deep rosé sometimes. And even though that Riesling is the most planted white at 21 hectares, it's second in overall in the entire region behind Trollinger, and then we follow up with our other reds. So yeah, I think what we can remember here is we have a lot of Schiava being made. There's a focus on red wine production, although Riesling is still highly planted. And then that they have this rosé style that is unique to area where it's spaced out blending red and white grapes together. And then this is kind of fun. Highest per capita drinking in Germany, gulped, not sipped. If you go to the local taverns, you're wine out of stemless mugs as opposed to wine glasses.
It's either that or it's a funny looking glass, which is like a very short, regular wine glass with like a green stem, which is then really like the stem of the grape, which is kind of a very weird one and has often like little grapes painted on it. But it's all to like, it can carry a lot and it drinks easy.
Man, I have pictures. I have like not these pictures in my head of all the ladies going around with just beer mugs in their hands. You're always just like looking at these tiny women like, oh, how the heck do you do that? They're carrying like half their weight.
It's a great summer job. It gives a lot of money.
Well,
you're right. A little bit further east, you know, then it's but also initiated by the monks, just like the wine.
Yeah. Well, I should keep myself moving too. I won't try to keep it too long here. Although it's nice to have someone from the area. It's like, oh, cool. Who signed up for tonight? Like us. Just glad to have some other people. I think people are just tired of Zoom a little bit, even though it's kind of fun for us to have this deep focus, because you can just learn a lot, and it interests you. Like it's nice to spend that time. But like Baden, how we had 9 different breeks, here there's 6, so it's kind of far flung, stretched out. But maybe if we try to just highlight 2 of these major breeks, Württembergisch Unterland is one of the major breaks, and that has the largest concentration of vineyards. Another major one is this Remstal Stuttgart, which is east of the capital of Stuttgart, more of an up and coming independent quality minded producers due to the population and proximity to the capital of Stuttgart. And then again, 3/4 still in the hands of cooperatives. If there are a couple producers, again, this is just someone it's like you read about in a wine book. I've certainly never come across them, this Graf Niedberg, but referencing their history, it goes back to this line of lords that began in the 12th century. And supposedly his brother, Stephen von Niedberg, is a producer in Saint Emilion. He has a slightly more recognition based there in Bordeaux. And then this Gerard Aldinger and then Rainer Schneidman. But I've personally never seen wines from them. And then you can see these breeks then now on a map. Our Württembergisch Unterland is the one. And then the Remstal Stuttgart seems like, so this is where a majority of production is concentrated. And then seems like where we have our young independent growers kind of shaping right next to the city of Stuttgart, if that helps. And then heading north from there, we're up in Franken. And then central Germany overlaps Bavaria, where there's a lot of beer being drunk here. Is the site of the Reinheitsgebot, where the very first beer laws that guided beer production took place in the 16th century. And now we're into the 6th largest size, 6,100 hectares. And then this is all based along the main river. So a lot of these areas over here kind of influenced by the Rhine or tributaries of. Well, the Main is a tributary of the Rhine, but just kind of then branching east. And then all vineyard sites, again, slightly based around the Main. But we're about 130 kilometers east of the Rheingau. So if you want to try to put that in time to drive, maybe like an hour or so. If you I always think of miles, but maybe a little bit longer with winding roads. but inland absent of moderating force of major river, most continental. And then winter severity threatens to kill vines. They have a lot of this to do in Washington and other places further north, like just spring frost. If it's too cold, you're just going to damage those grapes. So sometimes even in like Washington, they have to bury the bottom of the roots just to protect them during really, really, really cold conditions. Because it's more continental. Are you making sweet wines? No, because you're getting higher sugar levels and higher alcohol levels. So you don't have to balance out acidity in like a cabinet or Spätlese or Alsace styles. And then you don't see these bottle shapes too many other areas in Germany, are Boxbütels, which they've had two associations. One is your old Roman canteens, how you carry like your liquid along as like soldiers of the Roman army, or it's also known as a sheep scrotum. I have come across quite a few importers that bring Boxbüttel wines, but it's kind of specific to Franken. And then Riesling, only 4%, so a smaller amount. Just if it's grown here, how you're going to do it is that it has to be south-facing on warmer sites where you get all the sunshine. Otherwise, good luck. You're probably just not going to be able to ripen that fruit. And that's why Müller-Thurgau at 28% is the most planted. Why? It's easy growing and his ripens a little bit earlier and yields well. But Sylvaner, this is the grape to remember. Like we had Schruba over here kind of, and then we moved into Burgundian varietals in the center Brique, and then Wüttermburg. We talked about Schiller wine and other things, but and I think possibility for potential with younger growers. But Franken, they're kind of what they can hang their head on is the Sylvaner grape, which to me is kind of like just a lighter, prettier style of like kind of like a Sauvignon Blanc, where it's a little grapefruity as well and slightly herbaceous, but just always really refreshing. Occupying 20% of the most traditional, occupying 20% of the vineyards, and one of the most traditional grape of the area. And just a little bit more about Sylvaner is the grape. In this area, it has the highest percentage of total vineyard acreage than anywhere else in the world. So Franken dedicated to this grape more than anywhere else you'll see on the planet. And that it got this history during this cold periods during Europe, where it eventually migrated up into this area, and where people were planting, which again, through the help of the Cistercian monks, took place in 1659. And from that point, it had a period in history where it was the most important grape in Germany, where it occupied about a third of all plantings. So it's kind of fun, like if it was 100, 200 years ago, this is probably what a lot of people were potentially drinking as far as like maybe everyday styles. And then it's just kind of secluded itself to its home up here in Franken. Although lost top spot to Müller-Thurgau, again, its rise in popularity during the 20th centuries, and can be from Großlager sites, which is interesting. You can do Grand Cru, Sylvaner, and then other forms of winemaking where people are playing around with skin contact. If it's a build texture, you're not really seeing new oak, but they'll allow for mallow, so it kind of softens up that tart acidity. And then if it's not Sylvaner or Müller-Thurgau, you do have dry austere whites, and then it's a little Spätburgunder and Frühburgunder, which we'll bring up in a moment. And then you're wondering, well, how many Briques are there? Because I've got all the 9 down from Baden, right? And we know 2 of them at least from Wüttermburg. But no, like here's this Maindrich and Steigerwald. It seems like on the western side, this is where most Pinot Noir production is going to be taking place. Earliest wine growing 8th century, but if there's Pinot Noir coming from anywhere in Franken, it's on the western parts, Maindrich. The heart of production, where most is located, is in the center of Maindrich. 3/4 of Franken total. Here you're working with a little more limestone soils. And within Maindrich, we have Würzburg, which is also one of the major villages, and they're recognized for a couple of top sites. One of them is Stein, the vineyard, and Stein wine actually used to be the nickname for wines from Franken in general, and based out of this vineyard within Würzburg, within the center Brique of Maindrich. And then some charitable hospitals, you almost think of Hospice de Beaune in Burgundy, if you're a fan, this Julia Hospital and this Burgerspital that are located within the center of Mandrake. And then we get into the eastern side. This is where we kind of slightly get away from the main river, which kind of zigzags in and out, kind of forms a rectangle here, triangle in the center. But Steigerwald on the eastern side, further away from the river, less subject to humidity and botrytis. Botrytis is that little magic mold that allows for late harvest styles that dehydrates the grapes, and you're essentially making wine from raisins, but it brings flavors. So you won't see as much of that on the eastern Steigerwald. And then we're going to head up and almost there, you guys. Salt the far north, and then Sachsen. Again, this only became a part of Germany since the reunification in 1990, but we're above almost our northern latitude of where we can usually grow grapes. It usually kind of stops at 50. So while you're producing lighter, brighter styles, and then here an area that used to have, I think, like thousands of hectares being planted, it was just due to this root loss that came along in the 1800s, and then the difficulties of world wars that these sites have been just kind of abandoned. And now, like Salt Unstrut, it's now just working its way up to 800 hectares, where we're talking about like 25,000 over here, you know. It takes its name from the confluence of these two rivers, about 150 kilometers west of Sachsen right on the border of the Czech Republic. Again, influenced by the monks, and it goes all the way back to the 900s, so a long time ago. And then Müller-Thurgau, Weissburgunder. Müller-Thurgau is the most planted grape of both of these Weinbaugebiets. And yeah, it's not the Benedictines here in the 900s. Here we have bishops commanding the planting of vineyards as far back as 1161 over in Sachsen. This is a producer, Schloss Porschwitz. It's the largest estate within Sachsen, and they're the first to actually become a VDP member. And then again, Müller-Thurgau, Gold Riesling. This is specific to the area. There's only so much of it planted. But an aromatic crossing developed in Alsace, and I don't even think there's any Gold Riesling released in Alsace, but you might find it over there in Sachsen. And then we'll finish up in the R, coming back, but kind of worked our way east, and then we'll bring it back for 1 second. One of Germany's smallest and most northern, but 10th overall in size. And then, yeah, it's just that little off kilter. Even though we're further north, they have great Pinot Noir up there. It's just a little bit due to this hot pocket area. And the other thing besides Spätburgunder, Frühburgunder. Have you ever had one of those?
No, I have not.
Yeah, like we've had one or two on our list before. Actually, one of them was, I think, from Sachsen or Salt Unstrut. It was a couple of years ago, but it's an earlier ripening mutation of Pinot Noir, and it's thicker skin, so it actually has a little darker color to it, and it's a little tart, and it's a little tannic. But it's the same thing, and it's actually known as Pinot Noir per Côte in France. I've never really seen an example of that, but this is kind of a fun variant of Pinot Noir that if you come across it, if you like the tart and kind of dry, could be interesting to try.
Well, this class is going to make me try the Burgundy, like the Pinot Noirs again, because I shied away from them when I was younger, because it was like white was so easily available. But sounds kind of like it's worthwhile trying Pinot Noirs.
The Frederick Becker stuff is really approachable. They're not that expensive. They're the producer in Southern Pfalz. But they're just really easy drinking. The Enderle and Mole ones, even though they got known for that in Baden, some of them are just like amazing. And then next year they're kind of like, oh shoot, it's a little on the wild side. So from there, like it can be amazing, or it's kind of hit or miss. I don't mean to even paint that picture on those guys, but if you're looking for consistency or something along those lines. But yeah, volcanic soils up here, really steep like the Mosel, which is kind of cool to see some of these sites. And when you're enjoying these wines and you look where they're coming from, it's just like, oh my God, this is so radical. Like, yeah, no tractors being driven at all. Like, this not even possible. Yeah, and it's just like you're almost having to like grab onto the vine ahead of you just to pull yourself up, and like there's the little like not elevators, but those little pulley systems that bring you up and down the hill because they're so steep.
Super steep, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like you're just enjoying this $20-$30 bottle of wine, and then you look to see where it's coming from and where the grapes are planted. And you're like, what the hell? Like someone had to like farm those grapes. Like you just, it's that's why I think it gets to be cool. So it's steep like the Mosel, and why is it warm? It's the Eifel Mountains that kind of shape the eastern side and protect it from wind and other rains. And then Upper R, west of Walportsheim. This is just look at the two major breaks. Walportsheim is one of them, and then the other one, Loreley is part of Middle Rhine, as is Siebengrib. So it's Walportsheim and Artal. It's these two, or on the western side. And one major producer, Meyer Nicole. And if it's not Frühburgunder or Spätburgunder, they have a little flower Portugeiser planted up there for another. Well, thanks for joining in. It's nice to have you here, and it's really cool to have someone jump in and who's from this area, even if it's been 20 plus years or not.
Yeah, we go back, but not to try the wine. That's like the funniest thing. It's,
well, it just seems like some exciting areas that there's younger growers and this youthful mentality, it seems like, that are kind of shaping the future, probably in a lot of growing regions. But
yeah, it seems like it's more accessible nowadays. I mean, it was very hard. I mean, when I first got here, it's like there was no German wine to be had other than, you know, the Blue Nun, and I'm like, yeah, no, thank you. But it's,
I've never even tried a Blue Nun.
Yeah.
You almost want to just for fun. I don't even know if it's even available, or I don't even think. But
I don't know. It was like, I mean, it was like grape juice, and I'm like, yeah, I don't. Well, they're all grape juice, but it's like there's a good one, but it's just like, I don't know. It's like that's what you find in a supermarket, but then, you know, sooner or later, it just really evolved, right? And it's a lot more accessible, and that's maybe why we didn't do it. It's like, even if I drink at home, then if I come here, I can't get it anywhere.
Well, thanks for joining. Yeah, I'll send out the recording tomorrow. I'll send out a little added information on the wines that you have in front of us, so you can kind of see use some more information about them as producers and those specific bottlings. And then I don't know, you'll have my email too if there's any questions, or whatever it could be, like, oh, where can I try this Becker? Where do you think I could find it if you're interested, or anything along those lines? But
no, it was good.
This was great.
Question? Yeah, it's just nice to have you here, and I wish we
really
had
learned a lot. This was excellent.
Well, good. Yeah, you have the Kohler Ruprecht, the Kohlstadter Chardonnay. That'll be really fun. That's that producer based up in Sommergen.
Yep.
It's not like, sometimes it's kind of fun, and I'll let you get going, where you might find like a lot of podcasts where you can listen to the producers, and they help kind of shape and give context to the area that you can't necessarily find in a book. But I have a wine, the general manager for Kohler Ruprecht. In case you want a podcast later. I can't imagine that'd be the case, but you can hear a little bit. Right.
Yeah, it's like interesting. It's just like, I mean, as a German, is like the Pfalz is like a stepchild, right? So it's made a lot of progress, but it was completely overpowered by Rheinhessen when I was there. So that's really what everybody had, and it was very widely available. And you know, Pfalz was always like, oh yeah, it's like a little small region and nobody drinks it.
It's changed.
It's changed.
Yeah, Rebel stuff is pretty good. He's that Weissburgunder. We'd pour one of those by the Corbin, but that's considered like Grand Cru Burgundy. It's not there yet, and it's pricey, but it's not quite that expensive yet. Cool.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a nice night.
Appreciate it.
You
Have
too.
a good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.